Good afternoon and welcome along to Unbelievable with me, Justin Briley, the show that brings Christians and non-Christians together. If you can stay here on Premier Christian Radio through till 4 o'clock, after Unbelievable you'll hear The Profile. Two guests, gospel artist Sinach and Salvation Army pioneer Chick Yule will be on the programme. Well, today on the programme, we're asking, miracle healing, is it for real? We've got a skeptic and a practitioner. This is a subject we don't often cover on Unbelievable. Many Christians, as well as skeptics, are dubious about many miracle healing claims. But Ken Fish, who heads up Kingdom Fire Ministries, says that miracles and healing are very much part of the church today and should be part of the worldview of any sensible thinking Christian, as well as, of course, a witness to non-Christians of the power of God. Having studied under John Wimber, founder of the Vineyard Movement, today he travels the world with his healing ministry and training others as well. He says he sees the power of Christ being manifest through miracle healings on a regular basis. And in the course of today's show, we'll actually be hearing from two people who claim to have experienced miraculous healing through Ken's ministry. Well, dialoguing with Ken today is Unbelievable listener and lawyer Francis Janusz. Francis is an atheist and very sceptical of miracle healing claims, saying that a natural explanation of miracle healing claims is far more likely than God. She also has questions around the ethics of healing ministries and, you know, what are often alleged to be fraudulent practices, manipulation and so on. So we're going to be diving into this whole area, an area which is always fascinating, often misunderstood, I think. Ken and Francis, welcome along to the programme.
Hello.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
It's great to have you both. Before we come to you, Francis, you've been on the show before. I'll introduce Ken, who's new to the programme. Ken, this show has actually been in the making for well over a year. When we were originally put in touch with each other, I've had one or two listeners say, if you're going to do a healing programme, get Ken Fish on. I've heard you a few times on the Eric Metaxas show as well out in the States. Give us a little background to yourself, though. When did you sort of begin to experience and work in this kind of area of healing ministry?
My first interest arose when I was attending undergraduate university at Princeton. And it was a simple question, really. I was reading the Bible and I said, how come I don't see the things that are in the Bible going on around me today? And I started praying about it and reading books, and I went to a Francis McNutt meeting in Washington, D.C. Eventually somebody gave me some recorded cassette tapes, ancient technology, of John Wimber. And I could tell a lot of detail, but eventually I ended up in California attending seminary at Fuller Theological Seminary. I took John's MC 510 class, which was very popular and quite famous in its time. And I began attending John Wimber's church. Eventually I went on as an intern with him, and then I remained and worked with him for about 10 years.
And I know John Wimber has had a massive impact here in the UK as well as in the States and elsewhere. In many ways, today, healing ministry can sometimes have a bad reputation in some parts of the church.
Yes.
Do you feel John Wimber and what you're trying to carry on, as it were, from his legacy is distinct from some of those, what people often think of, perhaps, when they think of the, I don't know, white-suited televangelist asking people for money if they, and then they'll get a healing kind of thing?
Yeah, we don't do any of that sort of thing. In fact, I don't even have a television show. So, I think John really came out of an evangelical tradition. And as a result, he was really put off by a lot of the, we'll just say, behaviors of many of the Pentecostal-style healers. I'm not questioning so much even whether those healings are valid or not. I would just say for many people, the behaviors themselves create an almost insurmountable barrier
There's
to
a culture,
evaluation. That's
culture
right.
gap, yeah.
So we're very downplayed in what we do. We try to be understated. We don't make big claims. We simply pray for people. If someone appears to have been touched powerfully, we'll say, well, yeah, they were touched powerfully. And on occasion, there will be healings where it's undeniable what has happened. If a blind person receives their sight, that's obvious. You might go and get medical documentation, but it's really obvious what's happened. Whereas with things like this one case we're going to talk about today, cancer is much harder to put your finger on because it needs a lot of chemical assay, radiographs. There's a lot of things that go with that. And so with those, we just tend to say, well, we prayed. It seemed that something happened, but let's see what the medical tests report.
Well, what we've tried to do, and in a sense, a lot more work than I normally have to put into a show has gone into today's programme, just to get hold of some medical documentation, stories from a couple of people who have been touched by your ministry, Ken. So we're going to hear in this part of the programme later on from Victoria Bixby and her story of being healed from bone cancer. And later on in the programme, Carol Grigg, who had cysts and other medical conditions to do with her womb, which she says she experienced healing from through Ken's ministry. So we're looking forward to that. We're going to hear more about your ministry in a moment, Ken. But first of all, Francis, welcome back to the studio.
Oh, it's nice to be back.
It's great to have you
here.
What do you make of this whole area as an atheist, as a skeptic, Francis?
Well, I think, as you said, we all have reason to be sceptical, and we should all approach these stories with the with the same degree of scepticism that we would use in our normal lives. Clearly, I don't believe that this is God at work. I don't see evidence that makes that the most likely explanation.
Okay.
I would say that naturalistic explanations appear to me to be more likely.
Have you ever run in, just in your own personal life, to people, apart from Ken, who claim that they've had some sort of divine intervention, miracle, or and I suppose miracle is a bit of a flexible term. Some people talk about things like the birth of a baby as a miracle, for instance, and that might not necessarily fit a definition of something that genuinely transgresses the laws of nature or whatever it might be. Do you find people talk about this much in your experience?
Not in my personal circle. I mean, I can say that perhaps one of the something that adds to my scepticism is that my aunt on my father's side was a spiritualist,
right,
and often believed there'd been messages from the spirits and that there'd been healing or that they'd had advice, and there was never really anything to back it up.
Right.
If things went right, then the spirits had told the truth. If things went wrong, the spirits had been misunderstood, and what had happened was reinterpreted.
What sometimes is called confirmation bias in terms of the, count the hits and discount the misses, as it were.
Yes, or describe the misses as being a misunderstood hit.
Right. Do you feel that that's sometimes likely what's going on when people claim they've had some kind of healing, that they're sort of...
I would say so.
Yeah.
I mean, I haven't studied the area exhaustively, but I would be surprised if that didn't turn out to be the explanation for many, many cases.
It's great to have you in. And I really appreciate you putting yourself forward in the Skeptic's chair for today's discussion. Francis, thank you for joining us on the programme today. And I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to say. If you're listening and you'd like to get in touch about today's programme, as usual, you can get in touch via email, unbelievable@premier.org.uk. You can also find us on Facebook, facebook.com/unbelievablejb. Send us your thoughts that way, or via Twitter @unbelievablejb. And all of those links to our social media, today's programme, and where you can leave comments, and of course find the podcast and much more available at the show webpage, premierchristianradio.com/unbelievable.
Unbelievable with Justin Brierley.
So we're going to be hearing shortly Victoria Bixby's story of what she says was a healing from bone cancer. But before we get into that, Ken, just give us a flavour of what you tend to see. Obviously, these are going to be stories and examples that we haven't been able to show to Francis in advance. But what typically sort of things tend to happen when you are in different parts of the world and at a healing meeting, and I guess all kinds of different people are coming forward with all kinds of different ailments. Give us some examples of what you've seen recently.
Well, I could probably take up the entire hour telling stories, but, we see a lot of physical healings. They can range from blindness to deafness. We have had people healed of amnesia. Cancer is something that we do see frequently healed, not in every case, but frequently. We've seen cripples get healed, people who were in wheelchairs or sometimes brought in on stretchers or mats, things like that. So a wide range of physical maladies, and I'm not being exhaustive, I'm just giving some representative samples. We also see people often set free of mental illness, I guess is the best way to say it, although I know that term is somewhat out of favor. But examples, we've seen people set free of psychosis, schizophrenia, bipolar, depression. So obviously the realm of the mind is much harder to pin down than physical healing. Physical healing you can kind of measure before and after.
Sure.
But in one particular case that I often cite, there was a woman who was under care from 3 physicians in Australia, and she was healed of psychosis, and she was discharged by all 3 doctors, and collectively they had 90 years of medical experience, and they wrote in the medical report, in our experience, collectively, we've never seen anybody healed of psychosis, but we discharge her with no further need for any sort of care. And she is still attending the church where that healing occurred. So I'm in touch with the pastor, and I hear... I like long time series data. It's cool when something happens, and then a day later it still seems good, or a week. But what I really like is a year later, 5 years later, we can look back and say it's still there.
Yeah. And is your concern often, Francis, that with these sorts of stories, obviously these are just sort of off-the-cuff stories from Ken here, but that whether there is ever any kind of willingness to try and investigate them and see whether there really was a long-term impact, whether there was any kind of medical documentation to confirm what the person maybe reports as having happened to them?
I would certainly want to see that in any case where it was suggested that this was evidence of a miracle. I think until you've done the follow-up, and then what you've got is a temporary phenomenon, or possibly a temporary phenomenon. And we all know the power of the mind is a very strong thing, and people can, in a moment of well-being, in a surge of adrenaline, perhaps do things that they can't do in their normal day-to-day life, and then when it wears off, it's... I
mean, this is often the suggestion that's put forward, particularly, I suppose, where we do have, video evidences of people who maybe arrived in wheelchairs, got up and started running around the room at some event or another. And I think very often the concern is from people, well, yes, if you get an adrenaline rush, your body kind of pushes down the pain. You can maybe do things that you couldn't normally do. I mean, Ken, what's your response to that kind of a criticism of what might be happening in some instances, I suppose?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't deny that the body is capable of extraordinary feats under, we could call it inspiration or stress, right? Fight or flight. Think of what happens on battlefields sometimes. But this is why I like long-time series data. I like to go back and talk with people and confirm months and years after the fact, where are we with this? And sometimes people have had, shall we call it a euphoric experience or a religious moment, and what appears to have happened maybe doesn't stick,
right? In
quotes.
Okay.
But there are many, many other cases where it does stick, it is real, and things go on that defy explanation. I mean, again, this one's more. It's a story. We don't have the case study in front of us here, but this is a number of years ago. I was in Hong Kong, and a woman came for prayer, and she came to the front, Chinese woman, with 2 friends, and they all 3 came to the front. And as we prayed for her, she started shaking her hand rapidly like this.
And you're shaking it in front of me to demonstrate.
Yeah. It was her right hand, and she was shaking it, and kind of becoming very animated.
Right.
And all of a sudden she stopped and pointed at her hand, and she didn't have a little finger. She was missing her pinky finger, and it grew out in front of our eyes.
In front of your eyes?
Yeah. And, her friends were, they were going off, and we were all kind of, wah! But, I mean, I can look at you, Francis, and you've got that look on your face. I mean, anybody would, okay? Anybody would. What's more interesting is the next day, her husband, who was a medical doctor, trained in England, it's Hong Kong, and it was before the, giving back to the Chinese. Her husband came to the meeting, and before the meeting began, he came to the front and he said, I want to meet this Jesus because I am a medical doctor. My wife did not have a pinky finger. She does now, and whatever it is that happened to her, I want to know more about that. Well, I mean, that's pretty rock.
Now, I'm guessing you don't have that on video.
I don't, because it was years ago, and I don't go around with a video camera. We didn't even have portable video cameras in those days. But I don't go around with a video camera trying to I don't know, build this archive.
Right,
So,
yeah.
And as I say, it was a long, long time ago.
You see, I would have thought that would be newsworthy.
To who?
Well, somebody's little finger grows
Okay,
back.
but
to anyone.
But think about this one, because I've run into this before. One of the cases we almost did involved a guy that got healed of something, and later the authorities tried to prosecute him for medical fraud because they said people don't get healed of what you claim to have been healed of. So if she had gone, say, to a radio station and said, "Hi, I'm so-and-so, and I want to talk about my finger," Justin, you would have probably looked at her and go, "Well, what about your finger?" She would have said, "Well, I didn't have one. Looks like you have one now."
But
And, you would have said, "Well, but what proof do you have?" Well, you can talk to my husband, right? He would vouch for the fact that it wasn't there. And pretty soon someone would say, "You're doing this for money. You're doing this to gain some sort of notoriety."
What do you make of this, Francis? Do you feel like if people are having these things happen, they should somehow... You'd have heard about it this is what I often hear from skeptics is if all this was happening, the medical journals would be filled with it, and that kind of thing.
Well, not just the medical journals, just the front page of the paper would be filled with it. I can't see how it can not be known, not be publicly known that somebody doesn't have a little finger, and then they're pitching up with a little finger, and why that wouldn't get out as just news.
But you see, the other thing you have to think about is sometimes people just want to get on with their lives. They're not actually looking to do anything with what happened other than to have a life that is better than the one they had before the event. Not everybody's looking to make money or become famous.
She doesn't have to look to make money. What about her testimony as evidence of the power of Jesus? You said that it inspired her husband to come and say he wanted to meet Jesus. If that's happened to her, why isn't she publicising it for that reason?
Well, I guess we're hearing about it today. But I suppose for me, there's a wider question as well, which is a lot of people, as I say, have concerns generally about manipulation and this whole area. Are there any kind of general concerns you want to air at this point, Francis, about the way that sometimes it appears that things happen on stages and the kinds of ministries that are involved in some of this stuff? Because there's a lot of concern even from many Christians that this whole area is a bit flaky, a bit kooky, a bit and potentially open to abuse as well.
I think that it's agreed, isn't it, that there are charlatans. I'm not saying that everyone who is acting in this area is a conscious fraud, but I don't think there's any disagreement that people like Peter Popoff was a fraud, that he was carrying out frauds. He was exposed by James Randi. So definitely there is a fraudulent element within that practice. I am concerned from listening to the testimony.
That's just a story I'm telling. It's not. There's no documentation here.
No, I'm moving on now.
Yeah, okay.
I'm sort of moving on now to something perhaps a bit different. But listening to the testimony of, I think it was Victoria Bixby.
Well, we're going to hear Victoria's testimony. Why don't?
Right,
shall we go ahead and hear
yes,
it?
Yes,
and that'll give us something to talk
sorry
about.
To get ahead of us.
No, it's absolutely fine. Just to explain, what I've done for this programme is made sure that Francis and indeed Ken have both had the full interviews that I did with both of the people you'll hear in the course of today's programme, helping really to give you the backstory and so on. Because of the constraints of time for today's programme, what you're hearing is a much edited down version of these stories. But we're going to begin now with Victoria Bixby's story. Victoria Bixby is a Christian in the USA. Her story begins in 2011 when she was involved in a rollerblading accident in New York City, which saw her dragged underneath a bus. Her left leg was severely damaged, completely severed, apart from one tendon and one ligament. She stayed in hospital for 2 months, having skin grafts and other surgeries. Doctors initially wanted to amputate the leg and latterly wanted to reconstruct the knee. However, Victoria insisted on others praying for her healing. Against the expectations of the doctors, she says she was able to eventually regain almost full use of the leg without any major surgery, something she regards as a miracle in itself. However, in January 2015, there was further bad news. Scans of her body revealed that what was thought to be a hematoma associated with her accident was in fact a large tumour, and that the cancer, a rare form usually only found in children, had spread throughout her bone marrow too. Victoria takes up the story.
Finally, they gave me the results, and they told me that my tumor was inoperable. I had a cancer called neuroblastoma, so they came up with a plan, and they were going to try and shrink the tumor with chemo, and then try and operate, and then try and treat me some more. You need to prepare for the worst, is what they said. And what they implied was that we don't expect her to survive. It had spread to my bones. It was in all of my bone marrow. It was everywhere.
However, after a course of chemotherapy, the doctors were able to act on the cancer.
By the end of it, they had successfully removed the original tumor in my back. The tumor in my bone marrow had matured into the benign form, and so it was no longer cancerous, but it was still throughout my bones. And they suspect that it has to do with the chemotherapy and radiation and variety of treatments that I've received. They only have 6 examples of it happening, and adult patients are rare in general. So that's the hypothesis, but it's far from being an established proof.
Nevertheless, Victoria's health continued to be affected by the presence of the benign tumour throughout her skeleton.
The bone marrow biopsies that they took were coming back. They were showing 90% tumor. Your bone marrow makes your blood, so my blood production was hampered by 90%. The PET scan, which picks up cancer, was coming back completely clear except for one spot on my left interior knee, which is exactly where my knee got ground into the road. They gave me extra radiation. They gave me all these extra treatments trying to target that. And finally they came to me and they said, we want to cut out what we think is cancer in your knee. And I'm like, I'm already missing a quarter of my knee, and this is my miracle knee, and I really don't want you to cut it out. I said, for a year I've been saying I think this PET scan is a false positive, and I think that it's my knee continuing to heal. And the doctors were saying, no, your knee's had way too much radiation. There's no way that any healing can be happening. We've irradiated it too much. It's dead. And I said, well, I'm going to pray. I'm not okay with having 90% of my bone marrow being tumor. And the fellow that had been overseeing me looked at me and she said, Victoria, you need to be okay with this. You need to get used to this. You need to accept this. There's no treatment for this type of tumor in your bones, and you need to resign yourself to the fact that you're going to have diminished blood production for the rest of your life. And I looked at her and I said, that's why it's called a miracle. And it was about a week or 2 later that I went to see Ken, and he got a word, said, I feel like there's someone here who has tumor on these organs in their body on the right side. So I raised my hand and I'm like, well, my tumor's not there, but what you're describing is where my tumor was. Ken says, well, you're in the general vicinity of where I thought this person was sitting, so let's pray for you. I come to the front and he lays hands on me, and the Holy Spirit kind of comes on me like a fog. It's like this totally relaxing thing. I collapsed to the ground. I was like a noodle, and it was awesome. And this was the first time I'd ever felt this. Felt like there was an electric current going through my entire body. But it came and it stayed. That whole night I felt like that current coursing through my body. And I went back and I got into bed that night. And even as I was falling asleep, I felt it coursing through my body.
Meanwhile, Victoria's doctor recommended pressing ahead with surgery to cut out the portion of the knee they still believed was cancerous. Victoria eventually agreed on one condition. When she went into theatre, they would first do fresh biopsies on the knee to check if it really was cancerous.
So for a week, I'm praying about this. And about halfway through, I felt like the Lord came to me and he said to me, Victoria, I can withstand scientific scrutiny. And that gave me a lot of peace. I went and I had the surgery. And when I woke up, the first thing I wanted to know was, what did you take out? They had done 3 biopsies and a bone scraping. All of the biopsies and bone scrapings had come back clear, and that they would have to wait a week or 2 for the pathology report. And when the pathology reports came back, showing that that area was undergoing healing and had inflammation, and that was the reason that the PET scan for the past year had been positive, I had this picture in my head of the finger of God just resting on that part of my knee, which kept lighting up the PET scan but kept healing my knee.
But even more surprising news was to follow. Previously, her biopsies on her bone marrow had shown over 90% tumour. However, following the prayer meeting with Ken, the next set of biopsies produced a very different set of results.
When they did the scan again, it had dropped to less than 10%, and my platelet counts and other counts had suddenly risen. One of the senior attendings and I actually spoke, and I said, "That's really good news." And he said, "Victoria, we can't explain this." He said, "This doesn't happen." He said, "We could potentially say, well, that's just an area in the particular sample that we got." Except for multiple samples came back, and they take it from 4 locations. So the drop can't be attributed to a variation within that particular pocket of the marrow, because he said the samples that we took were consistent within themselves. And in addition to that, there's been a change in what is going on in your blood production, and that your blood is healthier now. One of the senior attendings, the top dogs in the department, we went through all of my tests. And he said, "Victoria, we can't explain how it happened or why it happened, but it is substantial and it is demonstrative that there has been a change." And I just smiled and was grateful and went home and praised God and thanked him and asked for more.
Today, Victoria's biopsies show less than 5% tumour in the bone marrow, and she's even begun to be able to run on her once severed leg. Even though her healing has been a long journey, and despite all the pain, Victoria says she still wouldn't trade it.
I'm grateful for the process. I hate it at times, but I wouldn't trade it for anything. There have been a lot of times where I have wanted to give up in many different ways. I think I've imagined all the different ways that one possibly could give up. But the Lord has been faithful to me in all of them. He has been my strength when I had no strength, and He has made it bearable when it is unbearable. I am not at 100%. I'm asking to be as good as or better before all of this happened. And I am confident that one day I will receive the fullness. And so I'm not concerned by the fact that I am at 90% or 95%. I know that it's coming, and I keep seeing the incremental improvements. He is doing so much other stuff in me too, in terms of my faith and my understanding and who He is and all of that, that I have enough stuff to keep me busy and enough wonderful things that are happening in my life. I don't need to sit and wait for the grains of sand of my healing to finish falling through the little egg timer.
There you go, the remarkable story of Victoria Bixby. Just out of time in this first section of Unbelievable. So my guests, Ken Fish, who was obviously the person involved in that story, and our skeptic on today's programme, Francis Janusz, will be talking about Victoria's story in the next section of today's programme. Do keep it here on Unbelievable. Don't forget you can find us online as well at premierchristianradio.com/unbelievable. We'll be back in a moment.
You're listening to Unbelievable on Premier Christian Radio.
Welcome back to today's edition of the show that brings Christians and non-Christians together every week. Here as part of Faith Explored, don't forget that straight after today's show you can hear another person's walk of faith and life in the profile between 4 and 5, and that has its own podcast as well if you want to discover it for yourself and the back catalogue. And don't forget you can find loads of other shows, including other programmes we've done on healing, which is the subject of today's programme on Unbelievable, at the Unbelievable website, premierchristianradio.com/unbelievable. If you want to get in touch about today's show, the ways to do that are there as well. I do encourage you to email in your thoughts as well, and we'll try and squeeze in as many as we can in future programmes responding to today's show. That's unbelievable@premier.org.uk. My guests on today's show are Ken Fish. He heads up Kingdom Fire Ministries. He's involved in healing ministry all over the world. Having studied under John Wimber, founder of the Vineyard Movement, today he says he regularly sees amazing things happening. Well, he's never sort of sought to really justify it in terms of medical evidence or video evidence, but increasingly that's what skeptics are demanding when it comes to some sort of evidence for these claims that people like Ken bring forward. That's certainly what Francis would like to see more of. And so what we've tried to do in today's programme with Francis and Ken is to actually hear a couple of, stories of people who claim they have had some sort of healing, and indeed provide some medical documentation. Now, in the case of Victoria Bixby, whose story we heard in the first part of today's programme, she's been able to provide us with documents which, as far as I can see, do bear out that certainly that element of her story about the way that the neuroblastoma, which was benign but still affecting her blood count, suddenly decreased after she had that ministry time at one of those meetings Ken was leading, which is fascinating. So the documentation that you've had as well in front of you, Francis, appears to bear that out. Of course, there are lots of other elements of the story as well, and we've only heard a very brief edited down version of it. You were able to hear the full story. But as a skeptic, Francis, what's your initial reaction, first of all, to Victoria's story, and what are some of the questions that arise for you from it?
Well, obviously I'm not medically qualified, so I can see that this is striking, that there's a history of a high ganglioneuroma, not quite getting the pronunciation right, I think, in the bone marrow, and that then there is quite a sudden drop. I accept all that. The documentation does support that. But in terms of attributing it to a miracle, I've got a number of questions.
Okay.
And one of my questions is that if this is the power of an omnipotent and omniscient God, to me it's noticeable that the prayer for that illness is started with a classic cold reading technique. And I'm not saying that is fraud, but because cold reading can be done by people who have a conscious belief that they are getting messages and they get results out of using the technique.
So this was when when she first of all came to this meeting, and Ken said, I feel that there's someone with a cancer, and I don't think anyone kind of put their hands up to say right. They had in this particular area. And eventually she said, okay, maybe Ken's talking about, I did have the cancer in there. It's since been removed, the tumour. And that was where things then progressed from. And your view is, hang on a minute, something funny's going on here.
Exactly. Yes, that doesn't seem to me to be consistent with God speaking, who knows everything and is all-powerful, speaking to you. He seems to have given you some wrong and out-of-date information that probably could apply, that was likely to apply to a lot of people, and then eventually somebody came forward and said, well, not quite, but close enough. So,
I mean, and it should probably also be made clear that you knew Victoria before she came for this particular, because you'd heard about her struggles with her knee and the leg and so on. I think she said she'd attended a few meetings prior to this, so it's not as though Victoria was a complete stranger to you at this point, Ken.
No.
But Francis' concern here is, hang on, you say, hey, someone here has a problem with a tumour. She says, that's me, though the tumour has been removed. What's your response to that? Because Francis' view, that's classic, as she calls it, cold reading, the kind of thing that, people do in a sort of spiritualist sort of environment where they're saying, I'm hearing from, Auntie Mabel or something, and oh no, it's well, I've got an aunt whose name begins with M. Yes, it was me. I mean, what's your take on that?
Well, we pray for plenty of people for whom there is we call the term a word of knowledge, where there's no word of knowledge given. Oftentimes we just have long prayer lines, and whatever people come up with is what they come up with, and we pray for them, and that's what happens. In that particular case, I have to say I don't remember the setting well enough to speak overly credibly to it, but there is this gift that is mentioned in the book of 1 Corinthians called word of knowledge, and it's not really given a full definition. I think word of knowledge is probably better for working purposes. I understand what the Greek translation should be for those of our listeners who may know Greek. But I think from a working standpoint, we might just call it a word of data.
Okay. And
many times when God gives us information, even the Apostle Paul, he says, we know in part, we prophesy in part. So we could ask for a higher degree of specificity. We might long for that, and at times we get it. But at other times we don't, so we go with what we have. So in that case, per Victoria's testimony, I spoke of a tumor. I wasn't particularly thinking of her. I just got what I got, and I all I had was what I had, so I gave what I had. And she responded to it in due course. But from what the recording said, she was thinking it must be someone else in the room.
Right. And
when no one else responded, she said, oh, well, then it must be me. And a lot of times we see this. We'll give a word out in a room, and initially people are hesitant. Maybe they're a little frightened. Maybe they don't recognize it's speaking of them. Maybe their mind's not quite in the right place. Eventually they go, wait a minute, hang on. I actually think that might be me. And what it does is it sparks a little bit of...
What's your reaction to this way of sort of, I suppose, leading into praying for people when and that kind of thing, Francis?
It's cold reading.
You think it's just classic
I think that's what people do. You rely on people. People are there. They're very motivated when they go there to believe that something is going to happen. They're very much wanting to think that somebody will get a message about them. And so if they can interpret what you're saying as being about them, they're likely to.
What differentiates what you do, in your view, Ken, to what happens in that sort of psychic environment where someone is saying, I'm receiving a message, and, eventually it lands on someone who feels susceptible enough for it to apply to?
Well, I think the source is different for starts. I mean, if we're talking about somebody who is doing a cold reading, they're speaking to the spirits. We are in communion with the Spirit of God, and He gives us information.
And I suppose one major difference is also that, whereas obviously Francis in the psychic case doesn't believe anything supernatural is going on, you're still open to the fact that something supernatural is going on, but it's from the wrong source. That's the difference.
I mean, depending on the context, it's not the same in every case, and this is the thing. Sometimes people will have very specific information about them, names, sometimes street addresses, things like that. Other times not, because this is the nature of what it is. We don't control it. God is the one who gives us those gifts, and then whatever we get from Him, we express. Whereas I think in the psychic and the paranormal world, there's a cultivation of something where they aren't so much dependent on the spirit; they're actually trying to control those spirits to make them work for them. So in Christianity, God's in charge, and He gives us what He gives us.
I mean,
in the other side, they try to use those spirits for their own ends.
Obviously, you don't believe that that's what's going on in this case, Francis, but...
No, I mean, can you see how, looking at it from my point of view, looking at it from the outside, the two things look pretty much exactly the same? What you're doing looks exactly the same to what I've seen go on.
I could see where you could say that, but you still haven't addressed the problem of what does the medical evidence show that we have this decline in this cancer.
Let's go to that, because I think that's the obvious place where, whether you have concerns over, the way that it all transpired. The fact is, something happened. Something has happened physically in this case. We've got the medical documentation for that. And it coincided, interestingly, with that healing ministry that she received at the church. The test before that, she has these tests quarterly showing the 90%. The next test after it showing 10% of this. So where do you go with that? Is it just them weird things happen? What's the kind of best explanation you could sort of proffer for that, Francis?
I would say remission happens. That's a known phenomenon in medicine.
However, in the case of neuroblastoma, there are no known cases of it going into remission in adults. It always happens in infants under the age of 18 months, if it ever happens, and even then it's rare. There are no known case history in the world. And I know this because I had a doctor who is a professor at Baylor University research this prior to this show. So it could have been the one-off, the one time in a billion years, but it's highly unusual.
Okay.
Yes, but I think it's and again, I'm going to put the caveat that I've got no medical qualifications, but as I understand it, neuroblastoma is rare in adults anyway. So
Correct.
there are not many conclusions, I think, to be drawn from the fact that you don't have previous instances of it.
I mean, as far as we can tell, though, the doctors certainly said we have no expectation whatsoever that anything, you're going to have to live with this condition for the rest of your life, this 90% sort of, volume of the bone marrow being cancer, essentially, or benign cancer, but certainly not able to produce the blood cells that obviously the bone marrow is there for. So, I don't know, it does strike me as just remarkable, something that obviously confounded the doctors by her own admission there occurred. Now, is it always just got to be the case that it's weird, unexplainable, but God just isn't an option on the table in a sense for you, Francis?
I think for me it's, and perhaps to some extent for Ken, it's always going to be difficult to say God caused this when we have no mechanism and no method of determining how God caused it. Normally when something causes something else, you are able to work out what the mechanism, what the causal connection is between the two things. And all we have here is an event happened, and after it something else happened. I think if you, for as long, I think, as there have been human beings have got sick and they've got better. They've had things wrong with them and they've recovered from it. And if you go to the temple of, now I'm probably going to mispronounce this, so do correct my pronunciation if I say it wrong. If you go to the temple of Asclepius, the Greek god of medicine,
I'll assume that's correct.
You will find testimony on the walls there from grateful people who he healed of a number of things. But you don't think that was really the Greek god of medicine coming to them in a dream as they slept in the temple and healing them. You would assume that there is some other explanation.
Right.
And I'm the same. I assume there is some other explanation. Something happened, something else happened after it. That's always going to be the case. In any place you go to, there will be people who will get ill and they will get better. Some of them
quick response from Ken, and then I'd like to play another story in that will also help us to look at these issues.
Well, again, my grandmother used to say, God works in mysterious ways, his wonders to perform. So I don't know that God always tells us the exact mechanism that he chooses to employ. What we can do is we can measure, here's what was before, here's what is after, and there was nothing out of the ordinary. As Francis is saying, they were this way, now they're that way, they got better. There is that sort of thing, but that in itself, let's assume that this is the correct line of reasoning. When we speak of miracles, I think we need to be a little bit nuanced in what we mean by miracles. On the one hand, miracles can be, this cannot happen. It is impossible for it to happen, as far as we know, according to the laws of physics and medicine. If that gets reversed, that's a miracle. Then there's this other category that we call miracle, which may not really be a miracle in the sense that they're going on this trajectory and then it inflects, straight up, and now we're up here. It can be more of an acceleration and a curve that rises. And so what we see is what could happen, but normally doesn't happen. Or if it does happen, it happens slowly. Now it's happening much more rapidly. Sometimes we want to call that a miracle, and maybe that's not, strictly speaking, a miracle as much as it is an accelerated healing because the hand of God has touched that individual.
Right. Let's hear another story. This is one from Carol Grigg. And again, it's just worth actually saying we hoped by the time of recording to have some medical documentation for this one. There is something that Carol's waiting on, and who knows, by the time this programme airs, perhaps it will be with us. But all we've got at this point for this one is actually Carol's own testimony of what happened to her. But nonetheless, let's hear it, and we'll hear this particular story. Carol Grigg lives in Victoria, Australia. Back in 2011, she had 2 children with her husband, but had experienced numerous complications during her pregnancies, as well as miscarriages. Her sister-in-law attended a local vineyard church and at one meeting received several words of knowledge to do with Carol that led to them meeting and Carol actually giving her life to Jesus Christ. Carol and her husband began to attend the church. It was shortly before a meeting that Ken Fish was due to hold at the church that Carol received some bad news about a set of recent hospital scans to do with her womb.
I was told verbally by the surgeon that it was over 60 cysts on my uterus and my fallopian tubes and my ovaries. I was also told that I had adenomyosis, which is a thickening of the uterine wall. Could end up being quite dangerous because I was bleeding a lot as well, and the pain was quite bad. It meant an urgent surgery. I'd had so many surgeries before that after the birth of my second child. So with the second one, what happened was that the stitches internally popped open. So I bled for a good 12 weeks. They did go back in to see if they could fix it up a bit, but they had trouble with that. And I had a weak spot in my uterine wall.
The doctor recommended an urgent hysterectomy, removing the whole of the womb, apart from possibly the ovaries, depending on what they found there. But Carol and her husband didn't want to face further surgery. Carol's sister-in-law persuaded her to come along to a healing meeting that Ken Fish was holding at the church.
So I turned up to the meeting in tears, actually. We listened to Ken. I'm not sure even what he was talking about, to be honest, but I did feel something. It was like someone was tapping me on the shoulder. Ken called people up the front to be prayed for. So we went up the front and my sister-in-law and another lady started praying for me with their hands on my back. And to me, it was burning hot on my back. I could feel the heat from their hands and I pretty much fell to my knees. I had no control over that either. Hard to explain, but to me it was like this big pink light was around me. Pink is my happy place. It's a colour that makes me feel good. I felt really at peace. So when the prayer was over, I basically sat there and cried with Steph, my sister-in-law. I just looked at her and I said, something's changed. And she goes, how do you know? And I said, I just know. I just feel it in my gut. Something's changed.
The very next morning, Carol received a call from her doctor to progress her preparation for the hysterectomy operation.
So he had rung me, and when I went in, he had said, I don't understand why, but I've got a different report that's come through. So he had received a report the week before to say about the cysts, and then on the second report it said that I had adenomyosis. He had no idea why. And no one from the hospital could tell who sent it. To me, that was a sign. It was like, okay, this gut feeling plus this, I've got to get this looked at. So I asked him, could I please get a repeat scan? And he said, you can. I think it's a waste of time. What happened was he gave me the referral. I then rang the ultrasound place. They are very hard to get into. You have to wait weeks. But the lady said to me, if you can be here very soon, then we can fit you in. Now, that's quite unheard of with that clinic. The lady, the radiographer who did the scan, and the look on her face, she was absolutely shocked because she had both reports in front of her. And I looked at her and I said, there's nothing there, is there? She goes, there's nothing. And she said, and she's the one that knew, she had done my scans where they had seen the scarring on my uterus from the C-sections. And she's like, I can't explain this, Carol. I can't. Everything's gone. She said, you could have another baby without a problem. To her, it didn't even look like I'd ever had a baby either. Because apparently a woman has been pregnant, she said that you would have some thickening of the uterine wall. Mine was pristine perfect, were her words. She was in shock. She went and showed someone else to make sure what she was saying was correct. And then I went back to the doctor the following day and he just sat there and shook his head. I cannot explain this at all. He goes, so I will have to agree with you. I think it's a miracle.
Carol's story doesn't end there. She did, in fact, 4 years later have a hysterectomy due to separate issues that emerged later. I asked her if that felt in any way a negation of the miracle she believes she received.
I was actually in a much better place last year, mentally and physically, compared to what I was back when my miracle occurred. Last year was it was almost like perfect timing for it to happen. I didn't really want to go down the hysterectomy path. I questioned whether I was doing the wrong thing by God because I'd had that miracle. But after praying about it, I clearly got I am just to follow his lead. I had the hysterectomy. You know, I've never recovered well from surgery. Unfortunately, I've had a lot in my life. And this surgery, I recovered within 3 weeks and I was back at work. Now, that's not really common for a total hysterectomy. It can usually be 6 to 8 weeks. I'm a 45-year-old woman, so these things actually do happen. So to me, it was meant to be. I was in a place where I could handle it. We could all handle it.
There you go. Amazing story, again, from Carol Grigg, and one that we're going to be looking at now in today's show. This is unbelievable. We're talking on the programme today about miracle healing, asking, is it for real? In studio with me, Ken Fish of Kingdom Fire Ministries, who was, again, the person leading that meeting, though in fact, Ken, it would appear, wasn't even the person directly praying in this instance for Carol at the time she believed she received this miracle within her womb. Lots of questions, though, that emerged from that, of course, and Francis Janusz here on the show is our sceptical listener today, listening to these. As I say, hoping that we can also get sort of the reports as well through from that sort of verify that there was this extraordinary difference at the time that she says this miracle took place. Where do you want to start with this one, Francis? And we'll let you sort of comment on it and then pass the ball over to Ken.
Well, it would have been interesting to see the medical reports, although obviously... If
by the time this goes out, we have them, I will obviously send them to you.
Sure. I mean, but at the moment, I have an account from a layperson, another layperson, and I've got no way of testing it or evaluating it. If I were to get the medical reports, I would approach them, I think, with a certain amount of caution, because as I understand her story, the hospital gave 2 inconsistent
that would be a
reports.
So she says there was a report that said it's cysts, lots of cysts in your uterus and ovaries and so on, and then when she went back after the healing meeting, the doctor says, very weird, but I've now got a different report, don't know where it's come from, and that's saying it's this adenomyosis, which is this thickening. But either way, the doctor said we should press ahead with the hysterectomy. Seems to be the story. And then she obviously pressed for no. I want to get a fresh scan done of the womb. But I mean, okay, if you were to grant, let's just say, for the sake of argument, that this is what happened. This, the strange thing happened with the reports, but then, to the amazement of everyone, there was a completely clear womb, as she says, pristine, perfect condition. Where do you go? Is it just another weird things happen kind of scenario?
Where I would go with it is that I would ask for comments from somebody who knew about these things. It seems to be in a different category from cancer, because we all know that cancer can go into remission, and that does happen. I would want to know whether there is any precedent for this. But I think what it always comes down to is that always with these miracle, described miracle healings, you are left with arguing, or you on the Christian side, not necessarily you personally, but the person who says there's been a miracle is always having to argue post hoc ergo propter hoc, which is a fallacy, because B happened after A must have caused B. And we can't know that. It's like there's a black box. You
can't know what it was exactly that caused this event to occur.
Yes.
And so it's an overreach to say it was God.
Yes, and that specifically it was this incident that happened previously.
What's interesting is that in both these cases, the change occurred at the time that healing ministry happened with Ken. So for me, that at least is an extra piece of data to put into the puzzle to say, okay, sometimes weird things happen medically, but these weird things happen medically on both sides of this particular healing ministry. I mean, does that in any way change the odds, change the picture a bit?
Well, they both happened after the healing ministry, or they wouldn't be being put forward.
Sure.
To say it's a cause, I assume you have to say that the ministry has to happen first, and then afterwards there's this change.
Right.
But one of the things in Victoria's testimony was that she said that at an earlier meeting you had been aware of, you'd been aware of something and had prayed for it then, and that was before the diagnosis of the tumour. So there we have an instance where her testimony is that you prayed for something and that doesn't appear to have worked, and then later different stuff happened.
We'll get Ken to come back on that, because we're already out of time in the second part of the show. It really is flying by today. So we'll see what Ken has to say in response both to Carol's story and what you say about the previous sort of prayer that Victoria had received from Ken. You're listening to Unbelievable today. Always a fascinating subject, and so many different directions we still have yet to go in, really, on today's programme on miracle healing. My guests are Ken Fish from Kingdom Fire Ministries. We've been hearing a couple of stories from people who say they've been healed through his ministry, not by Ken. They would say it's the power of God. But it's asking the tough questions today. Francis Janusz, our sceptical listener on the show today, come back in a short moment's time as we conclude today's discussion.
Believers and non-believers will all be helped, says Tim Keller. A wonderfully clear and accessible case for Christianity from a man who has hosted many of the world's most prominent skeptics and atheists, says Andrew Wilson. Beautifully written, brilliantly argued, will thrill and challenge, says R.T. Kendall. Unbelievable the Book by Justin Brierley. Download a free chapter and find out how it can help you make the case for Christ. Unbelievable.book.co.uk.
Welcome back to the final part of this week's Unbelievable. This is the show that brings Christians and non-Christians together every week here on Premier Christian Radio as part of Faith Explored. And you can find many more and leave your comments too at the Unbelievable show page, premierchristianradio.com/unbelievable. After we finish up today's discussion on miracle healing between Ken Fish and Francis Janusz, I'll be bringing you more news about Unbelievable the book. I was excited to be able to be on a Canadian TV show this last week talking about it, and indeed other news of unbelievable things coming up in the Canada area. So listen out for that, especially if you're a Canadian resident on the western side of Canada, as it were. Straight after today's show, you can hear the Profile gospel artist Sinach and Salvation Army pioneer Chick Yule are both on the programme today. You can also download the Profile as a podcast in its own right as well. And if you can come back next week on Unbelievable, we're returning to our science theme. Rupert Sheldrake and Susan Blackmore will be on conversation, and I'll tell you a bit more about that as well at the end of today's show.
You're listening to Unbelievable on Premier Christian Radio.
It's been a really fascinating programme today. We're going to just take a little more time than we normally do in the third part just to continue having our discussion today, because we've had a couple of really interesting stories that I was able to record in advance of today's programme of people who have claimed healing. Miracle healing, is it for real, we're asking today, and we've had a skeptic, Francis Janusz, and a practitioner, Ken Fish, in the studio talking about that. Ken says he sees all kinds of healings going on all the time. Now, very often there isn't medical evidence. These may happen in far-flung parts of the world where there simply isn't such documentation available, and very rarely is it, in fact, even in parts where there is medical sort of facilities available, is it the foremost thing in anyone's mind to kind of provide the kind of medical evidence that often skeptics are demanding. Just returning to one of the comments that Francis had in the last part of the programme there, Ken, she was pointing out, and again, this is because I sent you the fuller interview of Victoria's story, Francis, that at one point in her story, Victoria mentions that she had previous prayer from you in which you had, I think, sort of said that there was something going on within her, and if that was cancer, it obviously didn't heal it at that time. it was because obviously it later emerged that there was this tumour within her and the neuroblastoma and so on. So I think Francis's question was, okay, you believe in miracles and God's power and so on. Why wasn't it healed at that point? I mean, I don't know. Is there an answer to that? Are we kind of second guessing why God does or doesn't do things at particular moments?
I just think the best answer is the simple one, which is we don't control God. So sometimes the Lord will give words that are maybe designed to strengthen somebody as they're coming into a trial. In this case, you're going to be diagnosed with neuroblastoma. And we never make the claim that everybody gets healed. Mm-hmm. But what we do see sometimes is someone gets prayed for the first time, they don't get healed. They get prayed for a second time, they do. Or 1 and 2 and 3 don't work, but number 4 does.
Why is that? Because I can imagine why, for someone like Francis, that's confusing. It's sort of, does God have to have
sometimes it's confusing for
attempts?
us, to be honest, right? Sometimes it is confusing for us. I flew here last night from Tel Aviv, and while I was in Tel Aviv, I prayed for a woman who'd had a condition for a number of years in her bladder, and she had received prayer from different people along the way, and she is herself involved in a prayer ministry at her own church. And I met with her and her husband, and we prayed for about an hour, and we spent some time talking before we prayed, and then we prayed, and something happened pretty dramatic. She even said, I feel something is happening right now, and there was a very obvious physical manifestation in her body as it occurred. Why did it take until then for that to happen? I don't know. And I would add, given that it just happened yesterday in Tel Aviv, and she's on her way home to South Carolina, I would wait to say, before I said anything very firm, I would wait to see what are the doctors reporting is the outcome of that.
I mean, when I've spoken to others, and I will let you come in on this in a moment, Francis, but others who have similar sorts of ministries to you, but perhaps it does take like a miracle, a healing occurs over several sort of prayer sessions and things like that. They've sometimes talked about this idea that there's a battle going on sometimes, a kind of spiritual cosmic battle, and actually it's not just a simple case of God can step in and zap the cancer or whatever. There's actually a sort of, in some way, we're involved in spiritually pressing against other oppressive spiritual forces and so on.
Yeah.
Now, I don't know whether to someone like Francis that just sounds like a very ad hoc explanation of why sometimes healing does seem to occur and sometimes it doesn't. But for you, can you just quickly speak to that as to what, for those who maybe have never even heard of this idea of a sort of, spiritual forces and battles and that kind of the demonic realm, what you think might be going on in these instances?
Well, biblically, the Bible says that, there's God and there's Satan. Satan rebelled against God eons ago and now opposes the work of God in one sentence or two. So when we are ministering and healing, we are very actively involved in the kingdom of God breaking in and pushing back the kingdom of darkness. But there can be various aspects of that. It can be quite personal. Sometimes it's much broader and societal. But in the case of healing ministry, it tends to be narrowly focused on the bodies of those who are being healed. So with that, what we find is a lot of times, not unlike in a real war, there can be landmines or booby traps and things that we got to kind of remove those out of the way. And as those things get cleaned up, then the healing power of God can flow more readily.
And those could include, for instance, spiritual oppression or demonic oppression, which has to be dealt with. And so I know that you're very involved as well as in the healing side with deliverance ministry and that kind of thing. All of this may just make you sort of think, goodness me,
these people
Francis
have lost their minds.
No, I don't think that, but I think that it does impact, what you've said does impact on the strong causal connection that you've tried to make, and that I think that you've made to some extent, Justin. If there's prayer going on a lot, and then after one of those instances there is a change, that makes the supposed causal connection a lot less impressive, because if you're doing something all the time,
and it's
then
going
of
back to
course
this
hit
confirmation
lucky.
bias. It's
Yes.
Oh, you've remembered the hit and you've forgotten all the times where the prayer didn't work.
Yes,
kind of
thing. You wear your lucky shirt and your football team wins or whatever, and you've got to, you're wearing your lucky shirt all the time, and your football team had to win one time.
I mean, okay. I mean, you're a very logical person in this respect, Francis, and I appreciate your mind being put to this. So in a sense, your view is amazing stories, and I'm sure you're very happy, obviously, for Victoria and Carol, yes, and the fact that they have obviously feel like a miracle happened and where they are in their lives now because of it. But for you, this stuff happens anyway, is that what you're saying? And you know, whether or not Ken's praying for them, you know, mysterious stuff that is hard to explain naturally happens.
And you don't seem to me to have any method of distinguishing between a remission that could happen naturally and just statistically you would expect to happen to a certain percentage of people who come to your meetings, and a remission that's caused by a miracle.
Right, because I don't actually need to know the difference. What I care is that the person get well. And if it goes into spontaneous remission, so be it. If it's caused by the power of God, so be it. What I do know is, and you wouldn't have this point of view because, you know, you have a completely different life than I have. But what I do know is, you know, I hold meetings all through the year. Many meetings, you know, 250 meetings a year. I don't know, Kate, what is it? It's a high number. But
well, by the way, Kate is sitting in the corner, Ken's assistant, who's also sitting in on the recording.
So she keeps my calendar. But I do 250 meetings a year. And what we know is that there is this trail of people that are reporting they came to a meeting, they had condition X. They got prayed for in the meeting, and they no longer have condition X. And they may or may not have medical confirmation, because most of these people don't go around looking to build a medical case history that would withstand either medical scrutiny or a cross-examiner scrutiny if it were put on trial. Some do, and some have that kind of documentation, but most don't. And so all we have is these stories, but over and over and over and over and over and over again, people are saying, this happened to me.
Right. I guess, though, obviously for you, Francis, you'd need to see that mapped against some kind of statistical map, and whether it, I mean, just returning to Carol's story, what was interesting to me was that in the end she did have a hysterectomy. For completely separate reasons, as it turned out, to the ones that appeared to be present at the time she says she had a healing. But in her view, looking back on it, she says, if it had to happen, it was the perfect time. I was in such a different place at that point, obviously at peace and okay. And in a sense, part of the interview that I wasn't able to air, I asked her, you know, so is that in a sense confirmation for you that God works both through medical means, so in this case having to take out the womb, and obviously miraculous means? And for her, it was that. It was that, yes, sometimes it's medical, sometimes it's something very specific that God does. What do you think? I mean, is that, again, kind of post hoc rationalizations about things in your view?
Yes, I think it is a very typical example of confirmation bias, and on that aspect, that was something also that did worry me about the testimony from both of them, that both expressed some reservations about whether they ought to go down the medical path, and I do think that is a big worry about faith healing, that people can be taken away from seeking medical...
flush their medication down the toilet in an act of faith and then suffer the consequences.
Yes, although both these ladies, in the end, decided that it was acceptable, not everyone, I think, will come to that conclusion, and that, for me, is a big concern.
What's your view on that?
Just to be clear, we, in the meetings that I lead, I never tell people, avoid doctors, throw your medicine away. In fact, I always tell people, go get medical testimony, and if they tell you you're healed, then you know you're healed. This is particularly true with any kind of internal condition. As I said earlier in the show, if somebody's blind and suddenly they're seeing, you don't need a lot of medical confirmation of that. If somebody was deaf and now they're hearing, you don't need a lot of medical confirmation of that. On the other hand, if it's something internal that's more difficult to measure, it's almost like a chemical assay, well, in that case, there's really no way to know except that you go to the doctor. And so I always encourage people to work with their doctors, not work against them.
And you're certainly not against, obviously, medical intervention
not at all.
And that sort of thing.
Not at all. Medicine is something that, we have come up with over, many millennia to try and ease the misery and suffering of people, in their physical bodies or sometimes in their minds. So, Absolutely not. We don't work against doctors. We work with them.
Just as we start to close out today's programme, Francis, I'm trying to think what would constitute, or is there anything that could constitute proof of a miracle healing happening? Because in a sense, if, say, that woman's pinky grew back in front of your eyes, would you say, now I believe there's something in this, Ken? Or would you say, it's extraordinary, it's amazing, I have no natural explanation for it, but I'm afraid it can't be God, or I just don't think there's still enough evidence for it to be God? I'm asking you a hypothetical here,
sure.
but yeah.
I think that would have to be the start for me of an investigative journey.
Okay.
For me to believe that God is causing things, it would have to meet some of the criteria that I use to see other causal factors in the world. So one of the things that I would expect to see would, if it were God causing things, would be that it was happening, that people's fingers or limbs were growing on a fairly regular basis. Well, when I say regular, I don't mean that it would be common, but that if we could say, well, we know there are people who are born who are congenitally lacking fingers or lacking, have underdeveloped limbs, they have limb buds. And if we could say, but we can see that
when they get
prayed for, that is when these limbs and fingers grow. That would be pretty strong evidence. Right. I mean, that would it wouldn't be impossible that there could be another explanation, but to my mind, that would certainly start to point very strongly towards God being a causal factor.
What do you make of Francis's whole approach, I suppose, to whether we can assume God is the factor at work in these cases?
Well, to your point exactly. I mean, there are people who have ministries that are, recognized in certain areas. There are gifts of the Holy Spirit which exhibit as the Spirit wills, but people who frequently exhibit these gifts, those grow into ministries almost by definition. That's kind of the segue. And so there are some people who are actually known for these, I guess you want to say, repeated events that go on in their lives as a result of their prayers or however it is they go about, ministering to people. You may not have ever heard of them. Many of them are not really looking to become famous. They don't do it for fame or fortune. They just do it because God cares about suffering people, and they carry His heart for the world. And if you had a mind to investigate this, I could certainly introduce you to many people of this sort.
Well, I'd certainly be interested to see the evidence. I would need to see the evidence,
right?
Not a story. I would need to see data. But if you provided me with the data, that would be fascinating.
Then you'd be open to looking into it.
I don't think there's anything wrong with that approach, by the way. The gospel writer Luke, he said, I've made a diligent search of these things, and I've written this book, O Theophilus, whoever exactly Theophilus was. But the point is, he'd done a thorough and diligent search of the facts and stories around Jesus and his life and death and resurrection. And so he was trying to present this to somebody who was probably in need of that kind of confirmation. And, one of the things I always say in all my meetings is real healings will withstand medical scrutiny. And so I actually don't have any problem with your approach to it at all. I think it's in many ways quite robust.
Well, what would be really fascinating is maybe next time you're in the UK and it could work out, we get Francis along to a meeting and see what happens, and just see what you make of it. I think that would be quite a fascinating thing to do, to see it in person, as it were. But who knows? Maybe that's one for next time. Yep. Look, it's been really interesting, and I've really appreciated just the very good-natured way in which the discussion's happened. And thank you, Ken, for being willing to come in and be grilled, for Francis for asking the hard questions, and so on. Been really, really interesting episode of today's programme. So, Ken, people want to find out more about you. There's kingdomfireministries.org.
That's
there,
it. Yeah.
Place to go. But for the moment, thank you very much both for being on the show today.
Thank you.
Unbelievable with Justin Brierley.
Do send in your feedback via email, unbelievable@premier.org.uk, or Twitter @unbelievablejb is the handle, facebook.com/unbelievablejb to follow the show on Facebook. Be delighted to hear from you those ways, and I regularly post up articles that I think might be of interest to Unbelievable listeners there if you want to follow along. Not much time for your feedback, actually. We went a bit long with our discussion today, so I'm going to save up the science and faith sort of interactions from the last couple of weeks for next week's programme, when I promise there'll be more of a time to look into it. We had some interesting discussions on cosmology, and also with Science Mike, or Mike McHarg, last week in conversation with J.D. Walters too. So we'll get to those next week. Perhaps though time to mention a few Unbelievable book-related things. The book's available now, of course. Signed copies from the Unbelievable book website, unbelievablebook.co.uk, and also links there to the audio book and other ways to get hold of the book as well. I'm excited to say that I was on Canadian TV talking about the book this last week. 100 Huntley Street is a Christian show that's been going on for a long time out there, interview-based show, and I've also posted up the link to that as well, the YouTube link, on the Unbelievable Facebook page, so check that out if you want to see my appearance on that. And I'm excited to say I'm also going to be out in Canada on March 2nd and 3rd for the Apologetics Canada Conference 2018, taking place at Northview Community Church, Abbotsford in British Columbia. There's going to be a number of great speakers there, and it'll start off actually with a debate between Andy Bannister, who's been a regular Christian guest on this show, and humanist participant Justin Trottier. So I'll be moderating that discussion, and then I'll be contributing to main sessions on the Saturday and to some of the breakout sessions as well, along with a number of other distinguished speakers as well, including people like Andy Steiger, Dr. Paul Chamberlain, Michelle Tepper, and many more, including Andy Bannister. So do check that out if you're in the west side, as it were, not too far from Vancouver, this conference of Canada, apologeticscanada.com, taking place Friday and Saturday, 2nd and 3rd of March. And of course, Unbelievable, the book, will be on sale at the conference. I'll be able to sign copies there. And I've had some interesting feedback actually on that. This one from Jim Hall out in Texas says, I'm writing on behalf of the Atheist and Christian Book Club here in Arlington, Texas. Once a month, a group of Christians and atheists meet to discuss a pre-selected book. Your book has been selected for the month of December. What a lovely idea, a atheist and Christian book club. Sounds a little bit like what they do with the Unbelievable Christian and Skeptic discussion group here in London. But so glad that you've chosen the book. I hope you get some really interesting discussions out of it, Jim. Thanks for getting in touch. Also had this from an atheist who got in touch to say that why I'm still an atheist after listening to your book for 6 hours and 1 minute. First of all, I don't know you, but I have listened to your show and book for countless hours. I think you do a great job with your show and feel you're a good person. Your book has some great points in it, but sadly, no evidence. You said in your book that if Jesus was not resurrected, Christianity has no justification. And I agree. I see no evidence for Jesus' resurrection. No one has returned from the dead after being crucified. You point to the Gospels and those willing to give up their lives as evidence, but we know the Gospels were words-of-mouth accounts for decades, written down some 30 to 70 years after Jesus' death by one of 4 unknown authors and probably copied and added to by the later evangelists. This is less evidence than hearsay. As for the dying for a belief, we can point to millions of people who died for a wrong belief. This wrong believing martyrdom continues to this day. Many things in this world are unbelievable. I think why you're still a Christian is because you've invested way too much in Jesus. Your job, your marriage, and I dare say the belief of saving your children's souls are all invested in just one of many itinerant Jewish preachers. That was from Geek Dog, or someone who signs off Geek Dog. First of all, Geek Dog, really honoured that you've listened to the book, to the audio book. Thank you, and thanks for your openness in wanting to hear the other side, as it were. And obviously, you have not been convinced by the case I made in the book. If it's any help, I did, in one of the chapters, try to provide reasons for why I think we can trust the gospel accounts. That was in the chapter preceding the evidence for the resurrection chapter. And I don't actually put that much weight of evidence in the book for the resurrection on the followers of Jesus' willingness to die for their beliefs, though I do think it is actually significant. I don't put the apostles' death in the same category as martyrdom in Islam, because I think the first followers of Jesus would have known him and would have known that they were dying for a falsehood if it wasn't true that he had risen from death, whereas obviously many modern martyrs of the jihadi ilk are dying for a theological ideal that they've effectively become convinced of. But in fact, the martyrdom thing is only a small part of the minimal facts hypothesis that I lay out in the book. And so, for example, I'd be interested to know what you make of the fact that most believing and non-believing scholars do regard it as historically factual that the disciples had, what they believed at least, were experiences of the risen Christ. I think those are the kinds of interesting historical facts that that you have to look at when it comes to the evidence for the resurrection. Appreciate you getting in touch, though, and thank you for doing that. And there's been a number of other people getting in touch about the book as well over the last few weeks. I mean, really interesting reviews on Amazon as well. Just maybe time to read this one from Marion, who said, bought this book after years of occasionally listening to Justin's radio show and reading Premier Christianity magazine every month. I read the book over 2 days. As a theology graduate who struggled to reconcile my Christian faith with academic study in the past, I wish this book had been around when I was an undergraduate. At least now, 35 years later, I'm starting to reconcile the two halves of me. Thanks, Justin. Thank you, Marion, and all the rest who have been leaving lovely reviews and critical reviews on the Amazon page of The Unbelievable Book. Get it yourself. Signed copies available, as I say, from our own website, unbelievableBook.co.uk. Time now to sign off. Coming up next is The Profile, and let me tell you what's coming up on this programme next week.
You're unbelievable.
Well, we're back to our science and faith theme. Rupert Sheldrake caused a stir several years ago when his TED Talk on the science delusion got taken down from the site. Well, he's a Christian who's been banging the drum against a materialist understanding of science for some time, and his new book, Science and Spiritual Practices, continues that theme. He's going to be interacting with atheist Susan Blackmore on science, consciousness, and even things like telepathy and his own morphic resonance theory. So, should be another really interesting edition of the programme. Same time next week. Until then, have a good week. You've been listening to The Unbelievable Podcast. Subscribe on iTunes, Podbean, or any other podcasting software, and find out more about our other Premier podcasts at premier.org.uk/podcasts.